Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, Tim Carey of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions talks to Stephanie Desmon about the unprecedented case of the mother of a school shooter convicted of manslaughter for the horrific crimes committed by her son. While the egregious negligence of this case make it unique, Carey talks about how laws that keep children from accessing weapons could help prevent future tragedies. Please note that since this podcast was recorded, a man in Michigan became the first person to be charged under the state's new firearms storage law. The law requires gun owners to store firearms unloaded and secured with a locking device or in a lockbox if a minor lives at or is likely to visit their property. Let's listen.
Tim Carey, thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me on, Stephanie. It's great to be back.
So today I wanted to talk with you about the case of Jennifer Crumbley. In an unprecedented situation, she was convicted of manslaughter recently in a Michigan court because her son killed students at his school. Talk to me about this case and how unusual it is.
So the case of Jennifer Crumbley is truly, as you put in your own words, unprecedented, because never before in the history of this country has a parent been charged for the offenses committed by their child in a school shooting, which is especially saying something in America, where we have the highest rate of school shootings in any peer nations, totaling in the several hundreds. But this is the first time, again, a parent has been charged in conjunction to what their child has done. And so in order to get a sense of why this case is so important, let's go back to and look at the facts. There was a hearing in Michigan court, in criminal court, early in February of 2024, where the mother of the Oxford High School shooter was tried and found guilty by a jury of manslaughter for the children that her child killed that day. She was convicted of 4 counts of manslaughter, 1 for each child that her son murdered. And the rationale behind these charges was that she was so negligent, so reckless in how she handled firearms, how she allowed her child to have access to firearms, and how she failed to see or act upon all the warning signs that led up to the shooting, that the court actually found her criminally liable. And to understand the gravity of how the court reached this finding, we should look back to the Oxford High School shooting itself, which happened in November 30th, 2021. And on that day, school officials brought the shooter's parents into school to discuss their son's mental health and well-being after he depicted a gun and bloodshed on a school assignment. So his teachers were very worried. So they called his parents in that same day. And the parents opted to not take their child home. And hours later, the child began shooting fellow students and school staff with a gun that he had in his backpack. And it was a gun that his parents had bought for him a few days before. This child killed 4 students, wounded 7 others, including a teacher. And they were 15 at the time they committed this crime. And they were then later held in their own criminal case to be guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder, which they pled guilty to, and they were sentenced to life in prison without parole last year.
And so the mother had given him this gun. He was 15 years old and she had gifted him a gun?
Yes. So in Michigan, minors, which the state defines as children or youth under age 18, can possess guns legally in certain circumstances, but typically they revolve around hunting or being at a shooting range or otherwise being under the supervision of someone who's older than 18. So in this case, though it is technically legal and possible in Michigan without like age limits on possession, for this child to possess the gun, the context in which the child used the gun was not legal.
And I guess to me, these facts are egregious, right? They gave this child a gun. They taught him how to use the gun. He was showing violent thoughts in school, and they didn't pull him out or even say, "Can I look in your backpack and make sure the gun's not there?" They just went home, and then this happened. So this seems like the perfect case to find the parent responsible. Do you think we're going to find that there'll be other cases where the parent is found liable?
That's a great question, Stephanie. And it's definitely one that's been buzzing around in news cycles recently, given, again, the proclivity of school shootings in America. Was this case a watershed moment for other parents to be held criminally liable for the actions of their children? And I think that though possible, it's unlikely in large part because of just how extreme this particular case was. I mean, the parents gave their troubled child a firearm days before the shooting as a present and ignored flagrant warning signs of violence that were clearly evident to the school to the point where they brought the parents in. And so again, having the factors of the parents giving the child the gun, having the parents ignore the warning signs that their child was in need of help that were so clear that others plainly noticed it and even brought the parents in to directly intervene, and they didn't on the same day. And the facts are just, again, so bad in this case that I could see readily how a jury would find the parents' conduct to be worthy of criminal negligence, recklessness. But for the majority of school shooting cases that aren't this clear-cut, it's a lot messier. It's unclear, like, how the child got access to the gun at all points, how open or visible the warning signs were. And so even though I think this case is very important in terms of accountability and has done, as tragic as it is, at least a service in bringing attention to the critical issue of firearm access by minors, there's still much to be done in terms of mitigating risks of further violence in schools by guns. And I don't think this case will solve all of that.
Mm-hmm. And I also wanted to point out for our listeners that Ethan Crumbley's father is also scheduled to be tried for the same crimes.
Yes, that's right. And I should also say that we expect these cases to be appealed as well. Like, even though the jury has reached this verdict, the court has issued these findings, because in part the unprecedented nature of the rulings, we expect to see appeals. And so the ultimate level, which could take years. And so where the court ultimately lands is yet to be decided. But at least now in this moment, it's shown a new avenue, a different sort of treatment towards school shootings and accountability that hasn't yet been seen.
So this is an unusual case, but my understanding is about 3/4 of school shooters in recent years got their guns at home. So it feels like there's more to the story.
Yes. And between, I believe, the years of 1999 to 2018, comprehensive investigations of school shootings have found that around 80% of school shooters did obtain the guns they used in the shooting from their home or from the home of a friend, which in many ways implies that the unsecured firearms, the readily accessible nature of firearms, is part of what enables youth to harm themselves and others with guns, which brings the question to evidence-based policy that we at the Center for Gun Violence Solutions have advocated for in many states and have seen many researchers scrutinize to great effect, and those are the value of safe storage laws, which safe storage laws are essentially laws that provide clear guidance of how firearms should be stored. And they often involve them being in a locked container and unloaded and otherwise inaccessible to folks who are unauthorized to use them. Largely minors, children, but also home invaders, friends, guests, essentially anyone who doesn't own the gun, depending on the state, have proper licensure and things of that nature. And of these safe storage laws, there's a particular subsection or subcomponent called child access prevention laws, otherwise abbreviated as CAP normally. And CAP laws add an additional factor where they require that there be safe storage of firearms, and that if the child accesses those firearms, adds additional levels of criminal penalties in most cases, some state civil liability, but in any case, allows some penalty if a child accesses these firearms because the firearm was not safely or properly stored.
Mm-hmm. And I guess in light of what happened in Michigan, I understand you testified before legislators in the state of Michigan about safe storage laws.
Yes, Michigan had a landmark legislative session last year in 2023 regarding firearms laws and policies once their legislative body shifted dynamics a bit. And one of those critical policies that they introduced and later passed was a child access prevention law that was in large part inspired by this case, as well as seeing models across the country of this law being used and implemented with the hopes that it would reduce the rash of shootings we see and violence we see amongst youth, given that data from the CDC over the past several years has shown that firearms are the leading cause of death for youth ages 1 through 19 in the United States in 2020, 2021, and 2022. And though we're still analyzing data from 2023 and it's not related yet, it's unfortunately expected for that trend to remain the same. And so there's been a lot more focus on how to prevent youth from accessing firearms and using it to harm themselves or others. And child access prevention laws have been shown to be an effective means of doing so.
So we almost never see charges against the parents in the cases of school shootings. And I'm wondering if that is because the laws aren't in place. Is that because prosecutors don't choose to pursue the parents?
That's a great question. And it's certainly a case-by-case basis upon which it's observed. I mean, part of the issue and why we see fewer court hearings on these cases in particular is because they are tragedies. Often in these cases, the child takes their own life, which it can be painful. And for prosecutors, sometimes difficult to imagine trying a parent who is mourning the loss of their child. However, again, in this case, stark differential, the levels of negligence and recklessness on the part of the parents in the Oxford high school shooting case are on an entirely different level than the majority of school shooting cases. But still, it shows a trend that there's a general discomfort or unwillingness to bring charges in these cases if the facts are even clear enough to bring a case at all. Mm-hmm. Which again is why instead of applying punitive measures to try to bring retributive justice after the fact, which is important and has its value, preventative and educational measures such as child access prevention laws, which help put parents on notice about how firearms should be safely stored, and also establish the gravity of what it could mean if a child were to access these guns, can help, again, make it less likely that youth will access them and use them, especially in cases of suicide.
So even though the case in Michigan is unique, it does sort of open the eyes to what could happen if parents aren't more careful.
Exactly. And that's, again, this is a tragic situation, and it's terrible the facts that give rise to this scenario. But the hope is that it does at least raise awareness and put parents on notice that this is a severe issue and that in many cases, adults are connected. But for the parents buying this child a gun, he would not have had one. But for parents leaving their firearms unlocked, loaded, and readily accessible places, a child would not have been able to get it and use it to commit shooting. And so, again, a lot of our focus here is on prevention and how we can see the risks in front of us, calculate the measures, and then try to find ways to mitigate them. And this is where child access prevention laws really shine.
Are there other avenues that you all are exploring?
So there are a few. I will say in terms of evidence basis, child access prevention laws are some of the strongest that we see in terms of research denoting the implementation of these laws, at least laws that are strong versions. I should clarify, ones that impose violation penalties for the negligent, unsafe storage of firearms, as opposed to having a recklessness standard or something that's even a higher bar to reach, and that require the firearm be locked in a tamper-proof container and unloaded. Because each of these extra steps of precaution provides another opportunity for intervention to make it less likely. Like as a tamper-proof container, like maybe a child could get into it, possibly if they know the combination. But even if the firearm is properly unloaded, then it could help mitigate the risk of them using it impulsively in that moment. And so these are all critical factors to consider when implementing these policies.
Tim Carey, thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Stephanie.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmon, and Grace Cesiri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Cesiri and Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.